And we've got Costaki with us here on Muddy River News, and you'll be in Quincy at the One Entertainment Center on March 8th, brought to you by KZZK. Get your tickets at KZZK. So you're native of Georgia, born and raised in Georgia, went to the University of Georgia. So how did comedy get involved with your studies there?
Yeah, I actually, boy, this takes me back a little. I went to grad school. I was studying American government. I was fascinated in elections, and I was also in my hobby. I was fascinated in what made people laugh. I thought it was interesting that I could tell you a joke and it gets like a seven, and then I tell the same joke with the same intonations and the same beats an hour later to you know, to my brother and it gets a four. I'm like, how is that? It's
Right.
such an ethereal thing, what comedy is. It requires so much of the moment and the background and the understanding society and the beats and the attitude. And so I was fascinated by what made people vote and what made people laugh. And I was studying what made people vote professionally. I was going to go teach American government. And I was an open micer at the same time, running around Athens, Georgia, trying to figure out how to be a comedian.
So
And so I,
what was the primary goal though? Did you want to become a lawyer or what when you're studying
Well, I
government
thought I
background?
would probably wind up teaching, actually. Both of my parents had PhDs and were in the education universe. My dad taught in the University of Georgia system for about 30 years. So I was kind of thinking of following in his footsteps and footstep. He had one leg. And that's what I thought was going to happen. And I ended up doing my master's thesis about the influence of political satire on our feelings about government. And I studied Jay Leno monologues because at the time it was the election cycle, and he had all these negative messages about Clinton and Perot and Bush, and so my theory was we're a long-term exposure to negative messaging from our people in comedy hurts our feelings about government. And so I did a little study and I coded all these Jay Leno monologues for positive, negative, or neutral messages. And there was one positive message in like 1,500 jokes that I coded. And it was some kind of offhand joke
Hmm.
about how smart Jimmy Carter was. But none of the joke, I mean, all the jokes are about Clinton being a philanderer and Perot being a lunatic and Bush being a goof. And so the messaging was really negative. Comedy by its nature is derisive. It tears down its subjects, you know. It's when I write football jokes, it's so much easier to write about the Panthers or the Bears or the Falcons than it is the Chiefs or the Bills or the Ravens, you know. Comedy is derisive. So I studied that and I got my thesis. I went on the road and kept all my books in case I had to go back. And I've been on the road full time for 30 years since then.
So you did get your master's?
Yeah, I got my master's, but not my PhD. I bailed at that level, and
Uh-huh.
I got all the books. And I was thinking I'd try comedy, and then when it didn't work out, I would go back and get my PhD,
So
and
it's funny what
never
you
went back.
said. It's funny what you started this because that's what I was going to ask you is you think you're funny and your buddy may think you're funny, but then you go on stage and have to have the confidence that a room of 50 to 100 people will also think you're funny.
Yeah, sure.
So
And most
that's a really big step though, Kostaki.
That's a big step, and it's also not even necessarily a forward step. Sometimes it's lateral. It's one thing that most people don't think about until they mess around in this universe. Most funny that we have in our regular day-to-day lives is situational funny. It's funny because of the timing and the moment and the punch bowl and the office party and the reference to the thing that happened 2 years ago that the boss said. Most funny is not sort of professional grade works in all situations funny, you know? So that's a whole different gear to try to go down that rabbit hole and figure out what that is and how to build that.
But do you okay, so now you're on stage, you've been doing it for 20 some years. Are you trying to be funny for yourself based on what you just said, or funny to the general audience that you're because I think you may find some stuff that is funny for your general audience that you may not think is that funny yourself. Does that
Right.
make sense?
And over time, you learn to kind of weed that out. Just because it's crowd pleasing doesn't mean you should keep it in your act. You want to do what you think is good. And of course, the opposite problem happens too, where I keep trying something that I like and they just never connect with it. So hopefully over time, what you do is you build a Venn diagram of things that you think are good and things that work, And hopefully most of it is both of those things at the same
Right.
time.
Right. So so in the 20 years and when you started in college, did you do a lot of political then since your background was
I
studying the
did. I
election? So,
started doing quite a bit. It was more socio, sort of like I was pro gay rights and I questioned gun violence and, it was some of that kind of stuff. It wasn't, when election cycles happen, I would build out to have like a 10-minute chunk about the elections because I found that to be fascinating.
mhm,
And over time, I got a little jaded about politics. I got a little sort of naturally less interested. And it got so divisive sort of over the same arc. So I don't really touch politics much anymore, not because I'm afraid to, but because I'm not as interested in it as it used to be. And it's very expensive. You have to spend a lot of sort of comedy capital to talk about it.
mhm,
And I just rather talk about me and my life and my kids and my divorce and, the things that are happening for me in
mhm.
football and my crazy ideas, I think, are more interesting than politics for now. That might change. I might go back someday.
And how you latched onto football, you have all pro lines and the podcast and things along those
Look at this. I'm
lines.
wearing
And
the shirt.
there you go. And then obviously when you're on Bob and Tom, you do a lot of football, primarily a bunch of football stuff. So how much of your act now is dedicated to football versus what you talked about your personal experiences with life?
Oh, I don't know. It's probably a 10-minute chunk
Oh,
in
it
an
is. Okay.
hour. I don't want to overdo it. It
But how
depends on the situation. Sometimes I'm in a scenario where the crowd is digging it and we'll go down further, we'll go down that road a little further. But usually it's a small percentage of the whole show.
But how difficult, though? I mean, and a lot of comedians do this. Is your life experiences, the divorce? You talked about how what is funny is negative things, and you're basically beating yourself up on stage.
Yeah, sometimes, sure. Yeah.
So is that hard to share yourself, and then people know more about you than maybe your ex-wife does?
Yeah,
To a
it's
degree.
funny. I don't know. I'm not opposed to revealing on stage, being revealing. I think it's fine. And when I started talking about divorce, I was surprised how many people kind of connect and want to chat with you about it after. Like, oh man, I had a thing and with a lawyer and it's interesting when you talk about something that has a little more meat on the bones, you get more connectivity. There's more people. You can write a good joke about Taco Bell, but no one's going to come up after and chat with you about it.
Yeah.
If you're talking about some of your feelings and being alone, and I'm single. I don't know what that means, and figuring it out all over again. There are a lot of people in the audience that are having that experience, and they're connecting with that.
Mhm.
So it's got more sort of I don't know. It's resonance is a good word.
So how'd you connect with Bob and Tom?
Oh, those guys, I connected in the old-fashioned way. They're based in Indianapolis, and I would go work the clubs in Indianapolis. And I was an MC, and I was a middle, and eventually I was a headliner. I sort of moved my way up in the clubs in that place. And eventually and Bob and Tom has a similar kind of a thing. They would have some of the comics come in, and if you were new, you would get like the weird, like they would put you on at like whatever 9, 10 for 5 minutes and see if you were funny. And then the next time you came through town, if you had done okay there, they move you up to a different spot and give you a little more. And I eventually graduated to having the good spots and then eventually got to the whole another level, which very few comics get to with those guys, is having a regular segment, which changed my life. Not to be too dramatic about it, but being on that show regularly has allowed me to live my dream, to go to these markets and people come to see me on purpose. Now
Like
I'm not breaking any sales records, but
you're able to make a living.
I make a living as a comic, which probably couldn't happen without some assistance from them.
Uh, I kind of equate Bob and Tom to Johnny Carson in the TV world. If you could be a comedian on Bob and Tom, it's like when you got the gig on Johnny Carson. Is that pretty good
Yeah,
metaphor there?
well, Carson was sort of the gold standard because in the Carson era, there were only three stations and he was crushing the other two during that time slot. So Carson was a rare moment in comedy history where if you did that show, the next day you were famous. That sort of never happened before or since. So Carson is its own category to comics. But yeah, Bob and Tom has better numbers than the current late night shows have. So in a way, Bob and Tom is better. And with Bob and Tom, I could call every week. You couldn't do that with
Mm-hmm.
Kimmel or some of the other shows.
Are-
So, and over time, you build a connection with the audience. They feel like they get to know
yeah.
you a little bit.
So
It's
are
nice.
you, do you feel like you're in a part of a club with Allie and Al and the Tim Kavanaughs and those guys who are on there regularly?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, it's even more of a club with the ones who are the stand-ups who are out kind of on the road doing it all the time. Sort of the Bob Zanies and Josh Arnold, I think of as one of my guys because he was a comic before he was doing Bob and Tom. So yeah, the gritty road guys are the ones I connect with, the Drew Hastings of the world
Right,
and
right.
the Tim Wilsons and those guys.
Um, you're going to be in town on the 8th at the
Yeah.
London Center. People get tickets at kzzk.com.
Or
Uh,
Costaki.com has a link as well.
great, great. So safe travels, and we'll look
Yeah,
forward to
man.
seeing to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, man. I appreciate you doing this. Take it easy, Quincy. I'll see you soon.
All right, thanks, bud. That was good. I could talk to you all day. The first part, I could talk to you all day about that,
Oh, yeah.
about what's funny, what's not funny, because I've often thought about that. So I write children's books, so it's
Oh,
very
wow.
similar. So you put yourself out there, but what you think is good, you don't know if anybody else is going to think it's good.
It's hard to know what good is. That's the one beauty about stand-up. The horror too. You know immediately how it's going.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, buddy. We'll see you next week and be very careful.
Muddy River News. Our home, our news.